The moment Patton's driver lost hope as the general walked into the enemy line alone. October 15th, 1944. Near Metz, France. 3:47 p.m. Sergeant Caleb Hargreaves sits in the driver's seat of General Patton's Jeep, parked on a muddy road 2 miles behind the front lines. He has been Patton's driver for 18 months and has witnessed things that would give other soldiers nightmares. But what he is watching right now might be the craziest thing yet. General George S. Patton, a 3-star general and commander of the Third Army, is walking down a road alone toward German lines. He has no escort, no security detail, and no other soldiers. Dressed in a plain field jacket with no rank insignia, he walks casually toward enemy territory like he is taking a Sunday stroll. Hargreaves grips the steering wheel, watching his commanding general disappear into the gray Metz fog. A young lieutenant, Jonah Blackwell, pulls up in another Jeep. "Sergeant, where's General Patton? I have urgent dispatches for him." Hargreaves doesn't take his eyes off the road. "He's gone, sir." "Gone where?" Blackwell asks. "Forward reconnaissance." "How far forward?" Hargreaves finally looks at the lieutenant. "Sir, he's walked into what's probably German-held territory about a quarter mile that way." Blackwell's face goes pale. "What? We have to go get him." "Can't, sir," Hargreaves interrupts, his voice hollow. "He ordered me to wait here. This is the 14th time he's done this. Maybe the 15th. I've lost count." Hargreaves explains that the general conducts these solo missions because he doesn't trust anyone else to give him accurate information. He needs to see the actual ground himself. Blackwell stares down the road in disbelief. "What if he doesn't come back?" Hargreaves is quiet for a moment, then says something that has become a dark legend within the Third Army. "Then I'm going to have one hell of a time explaining to General Eisenhower how I lost the commanding general of the Third Army." This is the story of Patton's most dangerous habit, one his staff tried desperately to stop, but his superiors never truly knew about. It is the story of a man who survived 50 walks into the jaws of death, only to be taken by a random twist of fate. The heat in Tunisia was a physical weight, a thick blanket of dust and diesel fumes that seemed to coat the back of Caleb Hargreaves' throat. It was June 1943, and the young sergeant from Texas, barely 22 years old, sat behind the wheel of a pristine Jeep, trying to keep his posture as rigid as the man sitting beside him. Caleb had grown up handling temperamental horses and wide-open spaces, and he had thought that experience had prepared him for anything the Army could throw his way. He was wrong. His first day on the job as General George S. Patton's personal driver was not starting with a briefing or a tour of the headquarters. It was starting with a map coordinate that shouldn't have existed for a 3-star general. "Drive to grid reference 347 to 892, Sergeant," Patton barked, his voice like gravel grinding under a boot. Caleb pulled the map onto his lap, his fingers tracing the lines until they hit the red markings of the contested zone. He cleared his throat, his heart beginning a slow, steady thud against his ribs. "Sir, that's near the front lines." "Very near." Patton didn't even look at him. He just adjusted his goggles, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the haze of the desert met the sky. "I know. That's why we're going there." As they drove, the sounds of the rear echelon, the shouting of mechanics, and the rumble of supply trucks faded, replaced by the jagged, uneven rhythm of active war. Caleb could hear the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire and the dull, earth-shaking thud of artillery shells exploding in the middle distance. Every instinct in his body told him to turn the Jeep around, to find the safety of a reinforced bunker, but the man in the passenger seat sat with a terrifying, unnerving stillness. When they were within a mile of the fighting, the air smelling of cordite and scorched earth, Patton raised a hand. "Wait here," he commanded. Caleb braked hard, the Jeep sliding slightly on the loose sand. "Sir, where are you?" But the question died in the air as Patton stepped out of the vehicle. The general didn't look back. "Wait here," he repeated, his tone flat and absolute, leaving no room for the protests of 22-year-old Sergeant. Caleb sat frozen, his hands still fused to the steering wheel, as he watched a 3-star general walk away from the vehicle and straight toward the sound of the guns. For 45 minutes, Caleb sat in a state of suspended animation, flinching at every loud crack of gunfire, convinced that at any second he would have to drive back alone and explain how he had let the commander of the 7th Army walk into a bullet. When Patton finally emerged from the dust, he was muddy and slightly out of breath, but otherwise untouched. He climbed back into the Jeep as if he had just returned from a walk in a park. "Drive back to headquarters," he ordered. Caleb stared at him, his voice shaking. "Sir, what were you doing?" Patton merely wiped a smudge of grease from his hand. "Reconnaissance. The maps show a ridge that supposedly provides good observation. I needed to verify that personally." When Caleb suggested a reconnaissance unit could have done the same, Patton snapped his head toward him. "Reconnaissance units tell me what they think I want to hear. I needed to see it myself." In that moment, driving back in a deafening silence, Caleb realized his new job wasn't just a duty. It was going to be a terrifying daily gamble with history. As the weeks bled into months, a chillingly predictable pattern emerged for Caleb Hargreave. At least once a week, and often more frequently as the campaign pushed deeper into Europe, the ritual would repeat itself. General Patton would order Caleb to drive to a point just a mile or two from the front lines, step out of the Jeep, and vanish into the landscape for anywhere from 20 minutes to 4 agonizing hours. Caleb became a master of the silent wait, perched on the edge of the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar silhouette of the general. When Patton finally returned, he was almost always covered in a fresh layer of mud, clutching notebooks filled with frantic sketches of German trench lines and artillery emplacements. The burden of the secret weighed heavily on Caleb's shoulders. Patton had made the stakes crystal clear. "You tell anyone about my reconnaissance methods, and I'll have you transferred to a rifle company on the front lines." "Understood, sir," was always Caleb's reply, though the internal cost was immense. He was forced to become a professional liar. When General Bradley's staff or senior officers like General Hobargay inquired about Patton's whereabouts during his long absences, Caleb had to maintain a mask of calm. Patton provided the script. "Tell them, I'm conducting inspections." When pushed for specifics on which unit was being inspected, Caleb had to endure the general's snaps that it was none of their damn business. To the rest of the 3rd Army, Patton was the invincible commander, a man of maps and grand maneuvers. But to Caleb, he was a stubborn man who refused to trust the work of his own intelligence officers. Intelligence officers look at photographs and maps. Patton would growl after returning from a particularly grueling trek. "I look at the actual ground. There's a difference." Caleb watched as the general's boots became permanently stained with the soil of territory he wasn't supposed to be standing on. The tension was not just in the waiting, but in the constant fear of discovery by high command. Caleb knew that if Eisenhower ever learned that the commander of the 3rd Army was wandering in a no-man's land alone, the fallout would be catastrophic. He recorded his mounting dread in a private diary, noting that Patton seemed convinced of his own invincibility. Caleb, however, was a realist. He knew that in war, luck was a finite resource, and every time the general walked toward the enemy, he was spending a little more of it. He lived in a state of constant, quiet terror, wondering if today would be the day he would finally have to drive back empty-handed and explain the unexplainable. By August 1944, the race across France had turned into a blur of dust and adrenaline, but the danger of Patton's habit reached a terrifying new peak. Caleb sat parked near a cluster of shattered farmhouses, watching the general's back disappear into a dense tree line. The familiar knot in Caleb's stomach tightened as the first hour passed, then the second. Usually, Patton returned within 90 minutes, but as the watch on Caleb's wrist ticked toward the 3-hour mark, the silence of the countryside began to feel like a physical weight. He paced beside the Jeep, his hand hovering over the radio, debating the impossible choice: call for help and face Patton's career-ending fury, or wait and risk the general being bled dry in a ditch. At 3 hours and 40 minutes, a movement in the brush caught Caleb's eye. Patton stumbled out, but he wasn't the composed commander who had walked away earlier. He was limping heavily, his uniform was shredded, and a dark, wet stain was spreading down his right sleeve. Caleb scrambled out of the driver's seat, reaching for a first aid kit. "Sir, you're wounded," he cried, his voice cracking with a mix of relief and horror. Patton didn't slow down, shoving past Caleb to reach the passenger seat. "It's nothing. Drive," he roared, his face contorted in a mask of pain and adrenaline. The drive back was a deafening tunnel of silence until they were miles away from the sector. Finally, Patton leaned back, his breathing ragged. He explained that he had crawled too close to a German outpost and had been spotted by a sentry. The wound was a deep, jagged tear from a sprint through a hidden barbed wire fence, and the blood was from a long scratch that had caught his forearm as he dove for cover. Caleb gripped the wheel so hard his fingers went numb. "Sir, you were nearly captured," he whispered. Patton turned to him, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. "But I wasn't," he snapped. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, a sketch of the German position's rear flank. He revealed that the position was severely undermanned, a detail his intelligence officers had missed. By seeing it himself, he knew he could take the objective with a single battalion instead of wasting 3. Caleb remained silent, realizing the brutal logic of the man beside him. Patton was willing to trade his own blood to save the lives of 1,000 soldiers he would never meet. It was a selfless act of a madman, and Caleb realized that as long as the war continued, the walks would never stop. By September 1944, the Belgian countryside had become a labyrinth of dense forests and fog-heavy valleys. Caleb Hargreaves sat in the Jeep near the edge of a wooded ridge, the engine ticking as it cooled. Patton had been gone for over an hour, slipping into the trees with nothing but his ivory-handled revolver and a pair of binoculars. The air was unnervingly still until, without warning, the silence was shattered. It wasn't the distant thunder of artillery this time. It was the sharp, unmistakable crack of rifle fire, less than 200 yards away. Caleb's heart didn't just race, it stopped. That was the exact direction the general had taken. Breaking his own rule of staying with the vehicle, Caleb grabbed his M1 Garand and vaulted over the side of the Jeep. He ran low to the ground, his boots silent on the damp moss, his mind screaming that he was too late. He pushed through a thicket of ferns and nearly fell over a figure crouched behind a massive, fallen oak. It was Patton. The general held up a hand, his face a mask of intense concentration, his pistol drawn but held low. 50 yards away, through the thin veil of morning mist, a German patrol was picking its way through the woods. There were 6 of them, their helmets gleaming dully, their weapons held at the ready. They were so close Caleb could hear the rhythmic clink of their gear and the low murmur of their voices. Caleb dropped into the dirt beside Patton, his breath coming in shallow hitches. "Sir, we need to go." "Now," he hissed. Patton didn't move. "Quiet," he whispered back, his eyes never leaving the enemy. "They haven't seen us. We're downwind." They waited in an agonizing, airless silence for 10 minutes. Every snap of a twig felt like a gunshot. Caleb watched a German soldier pause, look directly toward their fallen tree, and then turn away to adjust his pack. It was a moment where the history of the war hung on a single heartbeat. If that soldier had taken 10 more steps, George S. Patton would have been a prisoner of war or a corpse, and Caleb would have been the man who watched it happen. Once the patrol vanished into the deeper woods, they retreated with ghost-like caution back to the Jeep. Caleb's hands were shaking so violently he could barely slot the key into the ignition. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking, "that was too close. You can't keep doing this." Patton, however, was already scribbling in his notebook. "I needed to see their patrol patterns, Caleb. Now I know they're operating in 6-man teams with inadequate flank security. We can exploit that by noon." He looked up, his expression devoid of the terror Caleb felt. "Nearly doesn't count, Sergeant. Drive." The drive back from a ridge was different this time. The silence in the Jeep wasn't the usual expectant quiet. It was heavy, suffocating, and charged with Caleb's simmering resentment. Usually, he kept his eyes on the road and his mouth shut, but the image of that German soldier nearly stumbling over them had broken something inside him. As they reached a relatively secure stretch of road near the headquarters, Caleb pulled the jeep to a sharp halt. The dust swirled around them, settling on the general's polished boots. "Sir," Caleb started, his voice trembling with a mix of insubordination and genuine care. "I can't do this anymore. You're a 3-star general. If you get killed, this whole army stops. If you get captured, it's the biggest propaganda when the Nazis will ever have. My job is to protect you, but you won't let me do it." Patton didn't explode as Caleb expected. Instead, he slowly closed his notebook and looked out over the rolling French countryside. For a long moment, he was silent, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine. "You think I'm a fool, Hargreave? You think I enjoy the cold and the mud and the risk of a German bullet in my back?" "I think you're reckless, sir," Caleb said, emboldened by his own fear. Patton turned his head, his blue eyes piercing. "I've seen the reports from intelligence. They sit in warm rooms and look at photographs taken from 5,000 feet. They see lines on a map. But lines on a map don't tell you if the mud is deep enough to swallow a Sherman tank. They don't tell you if a bridge is truly rotted or just looks it from the air. I save lives, Caleb. Every time I walk those lines, I find a way to take a town with half the casualties the experts predicted. My life is a fair trade for the hundreds of boys I keep from coming home in boxes." He leaned closer, the scent of tobacco and old leather surrounding him. "I need to feel the ground under my own boots. If I don't know the earth my men are dying on, I have no right to lead them." Caleb looked away, the anger in him deflating into a somber, tragic understanding. He realized then that Patton wasn't trying to die. He was trying to earn the right to live. He put the jeep in gear and drove on, knowing he was no longer just a driver, but the silent guardian of a man who viewed his own life as merely a tool for victory. By January 1945, the winter had turned the European theater into a frozen, monochromatic wasteland. The Ardennes was a jagged landscape of ice-covered pines and snowdrifts that could swallow a manhole. But the cold didn't stop the walks. It only made them more desperate. Patton had become increasingly obsessed with the German retreat, and he had added a new, more terrifying element to his reconnaissance. He began doing them at night. Caleb Hargreave sat in the jeep, the engine off to avoid the noise, wrapped in every blanket he could find. The cold was a sharp knife against his skin, but the anxiety in his chest was hotter. Patton had stepped into the blackness of the woods at 9 p.m., wearing a dark coat over his uniform. He had given Caleb a specific, chilling instruction. "If I am not back by midnight, you drive to the 5th Infantry headquarters and tell them I've been taken." Not a minute before, and not a minute after. The hours passed in a silence, so profound Caleb could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. At 10:30, a series of flares went up to the east, bathing the white forest in a ghostly, flickering green light. Then came the thwack-pop of an S-mine, a bouncing Betty, followed by the frantic, distant shouting of German voices. Caleb's hand flew to the ignition. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed at him to rush toward the sound, to save the man who had become his shadow, but Patton's order held him in place like a physical chain. By 11:45 p.m., Caleb was shaking not from the cold, but from the crushing weight of hopelessness. He began to rehearse the words he would say to the brass. "I let him go. I sat here while he died." He watched the luminous hands of his watch crawl toward the 12. 11:55, 11:58. He gripped the key, his eyes stinging with tears of frustration and grief. At exactly 11:59 p.m., a shadow detached itself from the darkness of the tree line. Patton appeared, moving with a silent, predatory grace. He climbed into the jeep, his face encrusted with frost, his breath billowing in the frozen air. He didn't say a word at first. He just held out his hand for the thermos of coffee Caleb kept waiting. After a long, shaky swallow, Patton looked at the watch on Caleb's wrist. 2 minutes to spare, Sergeant, Patton whispered, his voice raspy from the cold. "The Germans have mined the southern approach heavily. We'll have to swing the armor through the northern creek bed. It's frozen solid enough to hold the weight." He leaned back and closed his eyes. Caleb didn't start the engine immediately. He just sat there in the dark, realizing that for the first time in his life, he truly understood the meaning of the word haunted. He was driving a ghost who simply hadn't realized he was dead yet. The war in Europe ended not with a bang, but with a strange, hollow silence that Caleb Hargreave found harder to navigate than the artillery fire of Tunisia. By May 1945, the Third Army had ground the Nazi war machine into the dirt, and the walks had finally ceased. Caleb stayed with Patton during the early months of the occupation, watching the general grow restless in the quiet of peace. The man who had survived 50 unauthorized trips into the mouth of the enemy seemed out of place in a world without a front line. One of their final drives together was past a liberated German field hospital. Patton had ordered Caleb to stop, and for once, he didn't walk toward the enemy. He walked toward the wounded. Caleb watched from a jeep as the man who had once threatened to send him to a rifle company spoke softly to a young German soldier whose legs were encased in heavy bandages. There was no fire in Patton's eyes that day, only a weary, somber recognition of a fellow traveler in the valley of death. When he returned to the jeep, he simply said, "The war is over for him, Caleb. I suppose it's over for us too." But fate, it seemed, had been waiting for the guns to fall silent to play its final, cruelest joke. On December 9th, 1945, on a quiet road in Mannheim, Germany, the luck that had carried Patton through 50 solo missions across minefields and past machine gun nests finally ran out. It wasn't a German sniper or an S-mine that did it. It was a routine, low-speed collision with a truck. Caleb wasn't behind the wheel that day, but he was at the funeral. He stood among the rows of white crosses, looking at the casket of the man who had been his shadow and his nightmare for 18 months. He thought of the fog at Metz, the mud of Belgium, and the frozen nights in the Ardennes. He remembered the feeling of gripping the steering wheel and watching the general's back disappear into the mist, certain he would never see him again. He survived 50 walks into hell, Caleb whispered to the cold December air, his voice thick with an irony that felt like a physical weight. He walked within yards of their rifles, crawled through their wire, and laughed at their minds. And then he dies in a fender bender on a Sunday morning. As the bugler began the mournful notes of taps, Caleb finally let go of the steering wheel in his mind. The fear that had defined his war, the terrifying certainty that he's not coming back, had finally come true. But it hadn't happened in the glory of battle or the grid of reconnaissance. The warrior who had walked alone into the enemy lines 50 times had finally been taken by the one enemy he couldn't outrun: random chance. Caleb turned away from the grave, a free man at last, but one who would forever be haunted by the ghost of a general who had walked where no one else dared to go. The months following the burial at Luxembourg American Cemetery were the quietest of Caleb Hargreaves' life, but the silence was deceptive. Returning to a small ranching community in Texas in early 1946 felt like stepping onto a different planet. The vast, blue skies of the Panhandle were a sharp contrast to the gray, suffocating mists of Metz. Yet Caleb found himself looking at the horizon not for weather, but for a lone figure in a field jacket. He had spent 18 months living in a state of high alert, and his mind refused to demobilize. Every time a car backfired on the main road, Caleb was back in the Jeep, his hand instinctively reaching for an M1 Garand that wasn't there. He took a job at a local garage, finding comfort in the grease and the mechanical rhythm of engines. It was the only thing that felt real. One afternoon, while working under the chassis of a Ford, the shop radio played a news segment reflecting on the late General Patton's controversial leadership. The announcer spoke of Patton's temper and his flamboyant, ivory-handled revolvers. Caleb slid out from under the car, wiping his hands on a rag, a bitter smile touching his lips. They knew the character, he thought, but they didn't know the man. He realized that he was one of the few people on Earth who knew the terrifying truth of how the Third Army really moved. He thought about the notebooks, the sketches of muddy ridges, and the Sunday strolls into enemy fire. He felt a sudden, crushing loneliness. He was a witness to a secret history that no textbook would ever record. He had kept the secret to protect Patton's career, but now, with the general gone, the secret felt like a debt he still owed. That evening, Caleb sat on his porch, and opened an old wooden box. Inside was his service cap and a single, muddy map coordinate he had kept from Tunisia. He realized his paralyzing sense of duty hadn't ended with the war. It had transformed into a burden of memory. He began to write, not for a publisher or a newspaper, but for himself. He wrote down the dates, the locations, and the feeling of the steering wheel beneath his hands as he watched the heart of the American war effort walk away into the fog. He was finally beginning to understand that while Patton had been the one walking into the lines, it was Caleb who had been carrying the weight of those steps all along. The years turned into decades, and the world moved on from the scars of the 1940s. But for Caleb Hargreave, the war never truly ended. It just settled into the marrow of his bones. By 1975, the young sergeant who had gripped the wheel of a Jeep in the mud of France was an old man with silver hair and hands that still bore the faint scars of mechanical work. He sat in a small study in his Texas home, surrounded by the quiet hum of a life well lived, yet his eyes often drifted to a framed photograph on his desk. A grainy image of a man in a plain field jacket walking away from the camera into a gray horizon. Caleb had spent his later years as a guardian of the general shadow. He had watched as historians wrote grand volumes about the genius of Patton, detailing the sweeping movements of the Third Army and the strategic brilliance of the Ardennes. He read their words with a quiet, knowing sadness. They wrote about the maps, but Caleb remembered the mud. They wrote about the orders, but Caleb remembered the silence of the Jeep. He realized that the world saw the legend, but he had seen the man, the vulnerable, reckless, and deeply haunted human being who believed his own life was a small price to pay for the ground his soldiers stood upon. One final time, Caleb traveled back to Luxembourg. He stood before the white marble cross that marked Patton's final resting place, surrounded by the thousands of men the general had led. The cemetery was a sea of silence, a stark contrast to the thunder of Tunisia or the screams of the Bulge. Caleb leaned heavily on his cane, looking down at the name carved in stone. For 30 years, he had carried the weight of those 50 walks. He had carried the fear of the man who didn't come back, and the even greater burden of the man who finally didn't. "I kept the secret, General," Caleb whispered, his voice caught in the wind. "I waited every time, and I drove you home." He felt a sudden, profound lightness, as if the invisible chain that had bound him to the Jeep for half a lifetime had finally snapped. He understood now that Patton's recklessness wasn't a flaw, but a terrifying form of love for his men, a refusal to let them die for a hill he hadn't walked himself. Caleb turned away from the grave and walked toward the exit, his pace slow but steady. The fear that had defined his youth was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. He was no longer waiting for a ghost to emerge from the fog. As he reached the gates, he looked back one last time at the quiet rows of crosses. The warrior had finally found his rest, and at long last, the driver was free to go home. The story of the man who walked into the enemy lines alone was finally finished, recorded not in the annals of history, but in the heart of the one man who had been brave enough to wait for him. General George S. Patton survived 50 walks into the jaws of the German Wehrmacht, only to be taken by a quiet road in Germany after the guns fell silent. But his story, and the silent burden carried by Sergeant Caleb Hargreave, is just one of the thousands of hidden moments that decided the fate of the world. If you found this look into the secret, high-stakes world of the Third Army's legendary commander compelling, don't let the history stop here. Share this story. Do you know someone who admires the grit of World War II history? Send this to them and ask, would you have waited in that Jeep? Subscribe and explore. Hit the follow and subscribe button to join us as we uncover more untold stories of the men who stood in the shadows of giants and the moments where history hung by a single thread. Join the conversation. Drop a comment below. Was Patton a visionary leader saving lives through his walks? Or was he a reckless commander who risked the entire war for his own ego? We want to hear your take. The war ended in 1945, but the stories of the men who fought it are still being told. Stick around. We have many more to share. Click here for our next story.